Let's talk a little bit about the editing, the post-production. You talked about the kind of massive amount of footage that's shot. What role does the editor have? I know there's a term currently in vogue, predator, a producing editor. Do the editors, do they have a big part in shaping some of the story, or is it happened before that level, or what's kind of the discovery of the story?
Well, because it's a series, and because, in the first season it was 13 episodes, and starting with the second season, I think it was anywhere from 22 to 24 episodes. This is when the series was a half hour later, and 5 years ago it switched to hours, and so now it's 12 1-hours. But because it was a series, we've sort of always, there's a group of people who produce the show in the field, and there are field producers with each camera crew, and they send story notes back at the end of their shift. So when I wake up in the morning, I've got a whole bunch of notes, basically, on what happened. Those notes not only go to me, they also go to a story department headed up by a supervising story editor type. And they read all these notes, and then there are a group of young people just out of college who are making time-coded notes of all the video. And so the story department will track the story, and they will track the overall arc of the season for each character and for the various stories. And then they will also put together each individual episode, and that individual episode, when the show is a half hour, usually has an A and a B story. That half-hour outline, there's an outline that comes out first, 3-act structure, and we all discuss it, and then they go back and they actually do a script, which is usually about 12 pages when it was a half hour, and again, 3-act structure, and it basically has, maybe 14 scenes in it, and each scene is sort of a written description of what happens, and it quotes specific interview bites or confessionals. And so that is what ultimately goes to the editor. And the editor gets a time-coded version of that, so they know where all those interviews are. They know where all the source material is. But we really encourage the editors to take that script and watch all of the material around each scene, and not only watch the specific interview bites, but to watch the whole interview, so that they can really add their take on this. And we say to them, if you want to go radically different from what's in this script, we need to have a meeting. But if you're basically going to follow the script but make it better, add your magic to it, then go ahead and do that. And basically, we've always worked where the editor goes off in a room and they have their 5 weeks to get their first cut. We don't send a producer in. We have music people that can help them find great music. We have loggers who can help them find the material. We have the story department who will help them find other interviews if they don't have what they need. But we really look to that editor to be a storyteller. And so, unlike a lot of shows, we don't send a producer in. We hire editors who can tell a story, and we let them tell that story. And then after 5 weeks, we get a rough cut, and now we sit down, we all watch it, and then we sit at the table with the editor, and we've got the producer from the field, and we've got that story editor who put that outline together, and we've got the editor and myself, and we sit and talk about that first cut. And then we give a collective share of notes to the editor, and they go back and do a second cut. And then usually it goes to the network, and then they give us their notes. And I really feel that part of the strength of The Real World is the material is tested at each level. It's not like the director in the field or the producer in the field is getting to edit his own material. He has to justify what he did. The story people have to justify what they did, and the editor has to justify what he or she did. And so I really feel like that's why the shows really are so good, is because everyone has had to sort of justify their decisions to the collective group. And then if they can't agree, then I make a decision.
How real is The Real World?
The Real World is very real. It's funny, in the first years of the show, I'd be over at Warner Brothers or these different places having a meeting about doing something, and they were saying, "Oh yeah, we know how you do it. You basically you rehearse for like 3 days and you get basic script and then you shoot it, right?" And I'd go, "No." I mean, the early years of the Real Worlds, the people in Hollywood, the scripted people, were just completely confounded by what we were doing. They just could not process the fact that this could be real. And it is very real. It's, when Tammy found herself pregnant in season 2, we didn't go get her pregnant. She found herself pregnant. And by then she had developed a great relationship with John Brennan, the country singer, who was very conservative and very anti-abortion. And ultimately she decided to terminate her pregnancy. And John stood by her side as a friend. And the conversations they had were very different from the conversations you get when people are screaming at each other outside, a family planning clinic. So, the show over the years has really been able to tap into a remarkable story that has just come up because, a lot of stuff happens to people when they're between the ages of 18 and 25.
You used, during our little break, you used the term pure reality. Is that a good way to describe what the Real World has been?
I'm always afraid to use specific terms because the moment you do, someone will find a way to tell you that it's not. Yeah. I like to refer to the Real World basically as a docu-soap. Mm-hmm. It's observational documentary making. But it's sort of assisted because it's not like we go find 6 people who happen to live together in New York. We actually go and cast for those 6 people. We art direct the environment that they're going to live in. So it's not a documentary, but a lot of the truths that come out of it are as relevant and powerful as what you'd find in a documentary.
Tell me about the casting. How has it evolved from that first season along the journey of the show?
Well, for the first few seasons, we would basically put out the word that we were making the show. The first season was very challenging because people were like, "You what? You're gonna pay my rent? You're gonna move me into a place, and you're gonna film me? Is this like a porno? What are you making here?" So there was a lot of exactly why are we making this? What is this thing? So it took some convincing to explain to people what it was and make them understand. But starting with the second season, we basically would on the show itself saying, "Hey, if you want to be on the Real World, send us a card and a picture of yourself, or send us a letter and a picture of yourself." And we would get these letters and pictures. Season 3, I opened it up. It was a letter from Pedro Zamora, a young man who was HIV positive in Florida, and we were going to San Francisco with the show, and we had put the word out that we would love to have someone who was HIV positive in the cast, or someone who had AIDS, because we felt it was an important issue facing young people. And I opened this letter, and there was this remarkable story of this young man who had come over in the Mario boat lift from Cuba, who had grown up in this conservative Latino family, who had lost his mother at the age of 13, and who had sort of thrown himself out there when he realized he was gay, and ended up HIV positive at the age of 17. And had realized that he wanted to do something with his life. And at that time, being HIV positive was almost a death sentence. And so he got involved with AIDS education. And when he wrote to us, he talked about what he had been doing, but that, he had always lived in Florida and always been close to home. And he wanted the chance to go to San Francisco and a chance to maybe find love. And he wanted to share with people what it's like living with HIV, because as he said, he's not dying of HIV, he's living with it. And it was remarkable, and he was incredibly handsome, and I think we would have cast him whether he was HIV positive or not. But anyway, so that's how we were doing it at that point. We were getting cards and letters. And then when we went to London to do the 4th season, we wanted to include some people from other countries in Europe that weren't native English speakers. So we said, well, a card and a letter isn't really going to tell us what we need to know. We need to have people make a videotape. So starting in season 4, we asked people to make a 5 to 10 minute video about themselves. And so they would send in the video, and we would be able to put that VHS tape in the machine, and within 30 seconds you know if someone has the charisma, the spark, the thing that's going to make you stop on MTV if you're switching channels. So that sort of changed the way we cast, because we realized that a card and a letter will never, or a picture and a letter will never really tell us completely what we need to know. We need to actually see them on tape. And so that's what we started doing, and now I think, you know, every reality show asks people to send in a videotape. The other thing we did was we started to do, with the second season of the show, open calls, where we would go into a town, a college town perhaps, and we would let them know we were coming. And we would basically have tables set up with our casting people, and 5 or 6 young people would sit around a table and talk to our cast. And we would have them fill out just a one-page application, and that would give us some things to ask about. And you know, it was very clear for 5 or 6 people sitting around a table who had the charisma, who popped, who was the person that was captivating the other people in the room. And then we would invite that person back for a longer interview. So we sort of developed this process of taking tapes that were submitted from people around the country, and also doing these casting calls, these open casting calls in major cities. And then we would narrow it down to maybe the top 25 people, and we'd bring them to Los Angeles for a more thorough interview.
From season 1 to now season 26, I believe, what was the number approximately of your pool of applicants during that time?
Well, you know, the first season 1, we might have seen 2,000 people to cast the show. But once the show was successful, we were getting inundated with cards and letters. So very quickly, by season 2, we were up to 10,000 submissions. Probably at the height, we were at 15,000 to 20,000 submissions per season, making it harder to get on The Real World than it is to get into Harvard. You know, and I've sort of had a rule of thumb. Basically, I need at least 1,000 submissions to find one person. It's about 1,000 to 1 generally is, I feel, the ratio to find great people.
So if you have 7,000 plus, you're in decent shape, probably.
Well, I'd like some choices, so I'd like to have 15,000 plus.
Was there any reservation at all from any parties in the show about casting a cast member who was HIV positive?
The beauty of The Real World from the beginning, the core DNA of the show, was that it was going to be 7 diverse people, and that we were going to reflect all the diversity of our young audience. And so when it came to casting someone who was HIV positive, there was no question that they should be on the show. The only thing that MTV asked us to do was just to let the cast members know who were going to be on the show that there was going to be someone in the cast who was HIV positive, so that they could, you know, talk to their doctor about whether they were comfortable with this. It wasn't something I necessarily agreed with, but I understood that for the network, they felt that we needed to do that. And so we did that, and none of the cast members changed their mind. And what was good was they basically talked to their doctors, and the doctors basically explained that, you know, you couldn't just catch AIDS from touching something that someone had touched, that, you know, you have to have very intimate contact with someone to get AIDS. And so they, you know, it didn't stop anyone from coming, but I definitely think there were a couple cast members that were nervous about it. And quite honestly, I was happy they were nervous about it, because they reflected a lot of people's views at that time. And, you know, it allowed, again, for that growth that is so important on The Real World, and that story that we need.
When you cast Puck for the San Francisco season, did you anticipate the drama that would ensue when you cast him? That revolved around him?
Yeah, it's interesting. Puck was the last person cast for The Real World San Francisco. the first person cast was Pedro. And we sort of looked at our cast, and at that time my exec that we had was Lisa Berger, who's now at E! And who we work with on the Kardashians. And Lisa and myself and George Verschoor, who was our producer-director on the show, were concerned that our cast might just be a little too kumbaya, a little too PC. And there was this guy, Puck, who we had met, who was a bicycle messenger and who was sort of this outrageous, some would say obnoxious figure, but also incredibly charismatic and incredibly charming when he wanted to be. And Lisa and I and George went and had lunch with Puck. And, you know, we walked in and we were like, looked at each other because he smelled. I mean, but it was fascinating. And when we left the meeting, we were walking back to the office and we were like, should we? And we said, you know, it was one of those things where you say it's one of those people you just have to roll the dice on. And we're so glad that we cast him. And, you know, he began delivering from the moment before he was cast. I mean, he got thrown in jail the night before we were going to tape. And so we begin our story with Puck, and he's in jail. And he's getting out of jail to go for his first day on The Real World. And he arrives, and he's all scabbed up, and everybody thinks he's the guy with HIV because of what they thought an HIV person must look like. And you know, and then just the clash between him and Pedro was very powerful because they were both very strong, very charismatic people. You know, that was the season 3, San Francisco, where I think the show really broke out, where the New Yorker did a piece on the show. President Clinton talked about Pedro. You know, it's where the show sort of moved from the entertainment pages to the news pages, you know, and, you know, there were, again, some just very sort of almost eerie things that happened in that, you know, we finished filming the show and it began airing, and the final episode aired, and that was the same night that Pedro died. He only lived about 3 or 4 months after we finished taping. You know, it was just an incredibly powerful experience for everybody who worked on that show, who was part of that crew, who was part of that cast. Because, you know, Pedro and his health became something much, much bigger than the show itself. Years later, we were fortunate enough that we convinced MTV to help fund a movie about Pedro. And we got Dustin Lance Black, who later went on to write Milk, and J. Edgar. He wrote the script for it. And we made a wonderful film that we took around to film festivals, and it's played all over the world, and it later aired on MTV. That really told the rest of Pedro's story. And it was sort of fun making it because you were able to sort of pull back the veil and see a little of how the show was made and a little of what was going on when the cameras weren't running, as well as obviously the rest of Pedro's story, his youth in Cuba and his 3 months after the show finished, after he finished production on the show.
Why did you settle on 7 cast members, an odd number?
You know, like all good things, deciding on 7 cast members was not planned. That very first season, we had done 6 cast members in the pilot. And when we were putting together the cast for the first season in New York, we couldn't decide on the 6 people. We were at a standstill between Mary Ellis, myself, and George Verschoor, and Lauren Correa. We were all going over, and we just could not agree on 6. So we went with 7. And, you know, I think it's great that we did because I actually believe that there's something stronger about an odd number of people. There's an energy from having an odd number, and it's really worked better. And, you know, and there was a period after we went to the hour on Real World, we switched to 8 cast members. And we did that for a few seasons, and ultimately we decided that even with an hour to fill, 8 didn't work. So we went back to 7. It was too easy because when you had 8, usually you had 4 women and 4 men, and what would happen is you'd get this division between the men and women in the house. And by having 7, you don't get that division. It's a different, just gives the whole show a different energy.
Who wrote or conceived of that iconic, now signature opening, where each cast member has a little bit of a phrase about the 7 of us in the house?
This is the true story of 7 people.
Yes.
What does it go? This is the true story of 7 people chosen to live together and find out what happens when they stop being polite and start getting real. I think that's how it goes.
Sounds close to me, yeah.
You know, it's hard to remember. I do remember, you know, us talking about the Open, and I had always been a fan of shows like, going back to my youth, Gilligan's Island, that basically told the story in that theme song. And so I sort of like, you know, and because this was an unusual premise, we all felt like we had to explain to the audience what it was. And so we started working on this concept, and the Open was actually done by Lauren Zalaznick, who now heads up like NBC, Digital, NBC, Bravo, Oxygen, you know, Style. She has Style, and she actually made the Open, and we were all involved in it, and somehow came up with this idea that we would have the cast members narrate the Open themselves.
What did Mary Ellis's background in soap operas bring to this, as you say, a docu-soap, The Real World?
Well, from the beginning, the show really was sort of a mesh of Mary Ellis's and my experiences. Hers in soap opera storytelling, and mine in sort of news and observational documentary making. So Mary Ellis just brought a real keen knowledge of storytelling. And, you know, we would be sitting sometimes in story meetings where we would be discussing an outline for a show. And she would say, well, how would we tell this story if we were scripting it? You know, what would really be a satisfying story? You know, or she would say, yeah, I get this, but something's not working for me. Is this really the way everything happened? Or have you played with the timeline? You know, and inevitably she could spot like something immediately. And, you know, and she always believed that the truth was better than fiction. And so a lot of times when there was a problem with the show, it's let's go back and look at how this really played out. And I know you've tried to condense time and you're trying to add this B story and have this crossover with it, but let's take a look at what really happened, because maybe that's where the problem with this show is. You know, and in the early years of The Real World, it was very hard to find the people to make the show. There were music video editors, and there were documentary editors. But there really weren't these sort of people who could use music and tell a story. So that first season, I mean, I think probably 1 out of 2 of our, you know, I think there may have 1 out of 2 editors crashed and burned. You know, they would just they just couldn't do it. And again, we had this guy, Alan Cohn, who had done the pilot. And, you know, it was like he was doing triage on the episodes because, you know, they would just feel really flat because someone couldn't use music, but they could tell a story, or, you know, it had a lot of style, but it didn't have the substance it needed because they couldn't tell a story, but they could use music. And so it was really sort of teaching people how to edit a reality show. You know, because there's just no one knew how to do it. No one had been trained in it.
How has it affected the show along the history of it that the cast members are now very self-aware of what they're doing? I remember watching one of the early episodes of the DC version a couple of years ago, and I think one of them actually referred to himself as a cast member. And I don't remember that in the early shows. How has that affected the dynamic of kind of keeping it real?
You know, it's become much harder to cast The Real World today than it was when we first started because people have seen the show and they have preconceived ideas about the show and about their participation in it. So it makes our job harder. And so we have to really examine the motives of why someone wants to be on the show. And, you know, we've actually in the last few years, rather than just looking at people who send us a tape or who come to our open call, we actually go out and look for people. We will go down, you know, some of our cast members come from chance meetings. We met a woman, Emily, who was in The Real World DC. She happened to be work in a Starbucks next door to where we were doing an open call, and one of our casting people chatted her up and said, you know, you're sort of interesting. I'd love to interview you, and brought her over to it. So it's much more challenging and to cast shows today, and you can do it. You just have to work really hard at it.
Where did the idea, and when was the idea of the confessional introduced to The Real World?
Well, the first season of The Real World, we basically relied on into-camera interviews that we would do about once a week to give us the narration for the show. We realized very early on that we wanted to have our cast members tell their own story. And so even that very first season, I remember I did all the interviews the first season, and I remember, you know, sitting with Eric Nies, you know, our good-looking model from Jersey, who was on the show, and he loved it. He would talk into the camera, and he was thinking he was broadcasting live to people out there because he'd say, "Hey guys, this is what happened to me today," and he'd talk all about it. But we realized that sometimes, you know, when stuff happened, waiting a week to do an interview was too late to really capture that moment or capture the drama of what was going on in their lives, and so. With the second season of The Real World, we created what we called a confessional. We took like a big walk-in closet, put a camera in it and a light switch and a bunch of tapes, and basically you could go in there at any time of the day, put your tape in the camera and turn on the light switch and it would roll. And you could record whatever you thought. And we found that certain cast members love the confessional. They love to go in there and talk about what was going on. And, you know, and if something was happening in the house and we weren't doing interviews for a few more days, we'd encourage people to go in and talk about what just happened or what's going to happen, so that we would have that, you know, we would have that narrative, and we'd have it in the right tense. One of the things we did from the very beginning of The Real World was this idea that we didn't want to have the narration be in past tense unless it made sense to be in past tense. So, you know, when we would ask a question, we'd say, "You're walking into the room and what do you see?" You know, and, you know, they say, "I walk into the room and there's this guy and he's just sort of sitting there and his knee is bouncing and he looks like he's like about to fall apart." And it was and you chop off the first part, which is I walk into the room and I see, and you'd use the second part where they're telling you. And then when you take that and put it over as a lead into the scene, it gets you into the scene in a present tense way that doesn't distance you from what's going on. It's incredible how distancing a past tense interview can be. The other thing was we had them talk into the camera because we felt they were telling their story directly to the viewer, and we felt that was a much more powerful connection with the viewer than to have them talk to the interviewer. And that was stolen from the movie Reds. Or the When Harry Met Sally interviews. Anyway, because they talked into the camera.
Well, it's interesting you say that because the confessionals have been adopted by basically the whole genre of reality television.
And commercials. I mean, how many times have you seen a Volkswagen commercial or some other commercial where someone's like got talking in a confessional?
And sitcoms. The Office, of course, was doing that in England, but I mean Modern Family and other sitcoms, Parks and Rec, where basically there's not even an explanation. They just
Modern
have these
Family.
Scenes where
Yeah.
they explain
Yeah.
things. So how does that feel for you to know that your show influenced all of that?
You know, I do think the style of shooting and storytelling that is in reality television is influencing scripted television. It's influencing commercials. But again, I can't take full credit because we did steal that into-camera thing from Warren Beatty. So he gets the props. So
that's interesting.
Good for you, Warren.
And about reality television, when is the first time you even heard the term reality TV? Or did you invent that term?
You know, I don't know when the term reality television was used. We always said docusoap in the early years, but I'd have to go back and look at, you know, the various stories about the Real World to see when that term started to be used. Because when the Real World went on the air, the only other shows out there that were reality TV-like were Cops, which I've always considered more of a documentary, because, you know, they're basically going out and chronicling two cops dealing with something. And I think America's Most Wanted might have been on the air then. But there really wasn't anything around. Our friend Mike Darnell had done Alien, Autopsy, whatever that was,
Right, exactly.
and was doing a few things as specials. But there really wasn't anything else on where they had sort of turned the documentary form upside down and, you know, cast the people who were going to be in it, art directed the environment, and then told the stories in a very commercial, episodic way that you see in prime time, scored it like primetime television. It really wasn't around, and we, you know, so we were sort of by ourselves, and we would go off to the networks, the big networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox, and pitch, you know, doing reality shows, and they would just look at us like we were crazy and say, you know, basically said that their audience wouldn't be able to watch something like this, that it was, you know, it was a niche kind of thing that worked maybe for MTV, but it's not going to work for CBS. You know, there's just no way it's going to work for them. And it really took the success of Big Brother in Europe and the sort of predecessor to Survivor, this Robinson Crusoe thing that had been done in Sweden or somewhere up there, to really set the stage for the big networks in America to finally have the sort of take the risk on reality TV. And even then, CBS was so afraid that they let Mark Burnett sell half the advertising, much to their later chagrin.
What rules do you give the cast members in the Real World before you start shooting?
It's really important in putting the cast together that they understand what they're getting into. So they fill out a 26-page application, and it asks everything about their lives. And we feel like if someone can't really be open in the application, they're certainly not going to be open on the TV. And through the multiple interviews that we do with them prior to casting them, we sort of really want to explore with them who they are. We want to know exactly who they are before we put them on the air. And then we do reference checks on them. We call friends, we call people who are acquaintances, we call people that they don't even know we're going to call, to really make sure they are who they present themselves are. You know, Puck was who he said he was. He was no different in the interviews. He was no different in the reference checks. He was exactly who we had seen, and he was exactly who ended up on the show. And that's what we want. We don't want perfect people. In fact, flawed people are better. But we want people who can handle the experience. You know, and so when we finally convince that they are the right person for the show, we do tell them that they have to be open about their lives. They have to realize that anything could happen. We often mention the fact that, you know, Tammy found that she was pregnant. And she was incredibly courageous about sharing her story with the audience. Ruthie, in the Hawaii season, had a drinking issue. You know, that was shared with the audience. We really want them to understand that anything that happens during our production period is going to be on the air because it's very relatable to our audience. So don't come into this if you think you can censor your behavior. You know, and there have been people who quite honestly have come onto the show and tried, in a sense, to play a character. And the problem with that is you can't keep it up. And what happens is your roommates, your castmates, think you're weird. We had that happen with Beth Stolarczyk, who was in season 2 of the show. We didn't realize that she was actually, you know, wanted to be an actress. And, you know, and we would look at this material. We'd be looking. We'd be in the control room and we'd watch her. She'd walk in the room and she'd always find a way to position herself towards the camera. you know, and she would like create drama when there was no need for drama. And her roommates started calling her the drama queen. And then the roommates discovered her 8x10s, you know, and it all fit together suddenly. Beth wanted to be an actress. And they burst that bubble. And once they did that, then it all made sense and it was fine. But, you know, it's made us very, very careful about who we put on the show.
Are there deal breaker rules that have broken? The cast is, you know, has a private meeting with producers or anything? I mean, I understand that that it's a zero tolerance drug free zone in terms of the shows.
Right, yeah. I mean, there are certainly liability issues that you have to be concerned with because we're setting up the house. So, you know, we've always, you know, said that you can't, we don't care if you do drugs in your own life, but if you're going to be on our show and in our house, you can't be doing drugs. We're not going to make judgments about your life, but while you're here, you have to be willing to not do any drugs. And you basically have to be law-abiding, you know, and we don't obviously want people to hurt themselves or hurt someone else. And so, you know, when Ruthie got behind the wheel of a car and was driving while clearly inebriated, you know, we did everything we could to stop her. And we basically stepped in with the cast and said, you know, this can't happen. And ultimately encouraged her to seek some help to deal with her alcohol issues.
26 seasons were into the real world. You've repeated some of the locations 3 or 4 times. You have a lot of choices. Any reason you've come back to certain cities?
You know, it's in addition to the cast, the second biggest decision we always have is where is the real world going to be located? And we've always felt that it needs to be a fantasy destination for young people. It has to be somewhere where people say, wow, I'd really love to try living in that city. So it somewhat narrows the pool of places. And, you know, if you think about the cities where young people go to start out their careers or their lives, you know, they're usually big cities, places like Boston or New York or L.A., or they're sort of those cool places like Key West or San Francisco or, you know. So, you know, and there's a limited number of places. So we do go back occasionally to a city. We try to do it in a different part of the city. We try to do it in a very different setting from the terms of the type of house or loft. But, yeah, when you've been on this many seasons, you're sort of forced occasionally to go back to a town.
Are there any censorship issues? Are there things you just absolutely cannot show that you do shoot? And do you even have to, is there ever a circumstance where you actually have to destroy footage or get rid of footage?
You know, there's very little that we can't show. Obviously, it's basic cable. So, you know, if someone's going to have sex, we have to step out of the room at some point. You know, the door shuts, you know, whatever, and we step out. And, you know, and that's changed various times. I think the Chicago season, I was looking at some of what we had put on the air, and quite honestly, I felt like we went too far, that we were showing too much. And so after that, we pulled back a little on it. And, you know, it's been interesting. There will be things happen, like the whole Janet Jackson Super Bowl incident. When that happened, there was a lot of attention on MTV. So we've got some, you know, some concerns about what we were showing and what we shouldn't show. You know, so, you know, this show is not an island. And, you know, depending on who's in Congress, who's in control, it can influence how, you know, the decisions that are made. You know, everybody wants to keep their FCC license. So it's not, it's you know, and it's never to the point where we can't tell a story we want to tell. It's really just sort of like, sort of the silly stuff, you know, how much of you know, someone getting intimate are you going to show? How much, you know, can you, when you're dealing with a racial issue, can you use the N-word? You know, sometimes we talk with MTV and we say, okay, we'll use it the first time because we have to hear it in order to understand why it offended, and then from then on we just won't hear the word. So there are those kinds of decisions that you have to make. But overall, MTV's been an incredible partner and very, very supportive in allowing us to tell the stories that happen on the show.
What question do you get asked most about the real world?
The question I get most about the real world is it real? And I always answer, it's very real. We don't ask people to repeat an action. We don't tell them what to say. We cast our group of people, and then, we have the confidence in our casting that it'll all work out. Now, in the first few years, there was always this fear that, nothing would happen. Or we've learned over the course of shooting the show that there'll be, the first 5 or 6 or 7 days of production, you'll get tons of story. You may get 2 or 3 episodes out of that first week and a half. And then around the 3rd or 4th weekend, you'll get a lull. And you may have a whole week where you get nothing. And that first season, when we got that lull, that's when MTV said maybe you need to throw some pebbles in the pond. But we've learned that that's just life. There's those rhythms to it, and ultimately we'll get enough material.
What would surprise people to know about the real world?
I think the thing that would surprise people to know about the real world is that if we do anything in editing, it's that we actually protect our characters. Sometimes we will shade back or pull back on some of the more obnoxious character traits or some of the meanness because it's television. And one of the first rules of television is you've got to like the people enough to come back every week. You've got to be invested in them, and you've got to want to take this ride with them. So actually, I think most people assume that we try to make people look worse than they are, but actually it's the opposite. We want to keep these people likable. And we also always want to make sure that even though they may do something that isn't very likable, that they have a chance to redeem themselves within that episode. So sometimes, they'll do something really, really bad, and we will condense time so that in that same episode we can see them make up for that thing that they did badly. We won't stretch it out over 2 episodes.
What do cast members ultimately get out of being on The Real World?
I think each cast member gets something different out of the experience. I think they get, if they're doing it for the right reason, which is they want the experience, they want to live with people different from themselves, they will grow a tremendous amount during the experience. They will, they often come in, very much their parents' child. If you talk to them about politics, they basically say what their parents say. Their values, very much their parents. They really haven't formed their own sort of values. They haven't figured out what's important to them in life and how they measure people. And I think what happens is they really have a chance to sort of figure that out while on The Real World. And so you get people who I think are forever changed by the experience. And I think they're forever changed in a positive way in the sense that they come out of it much more open to others. There's sort of a little bit of an old-fashioned liberal idea to this show that, we actually have more in common with each other than we do not in common. And that if you get beyond the rhetoric and you actually sit down and get to know someone, you will find lots of common ground.
Who's the audience now? And has it changed since the beginning 10 years ago or so?
The core audience for The Real World has always been 12 to 34. That's what MTV sells. Now, because the show has been on for a while and some people just still love the show, we have a lot of viewers who are outside that demo. We have a lot of viewers who are 35 to 49. So we have very strong 18 to 34, 12 to 34, 12 to 17, 18 to 49 demos. We don't have a lot of people over the age of 50. I think at some point you get to an age where you just don't relate to it. And I think that's good. If you did, I think that would be bad, because then it wouldn't be for this specific audience. And, sometimes it's frustrating when, so many of the media outlets put out their weekly rundowns of the ratings, because they tend to focus on household numbers. No one sells household numbers. When you have to measure the success of a show, you really have to measure it by the core demo that network sells. And now, for 26 seasons, Real World has just done amazing core demos. It is, just consistently one of MTV's top shows in that 12 to 34 demo.
Have you kept in touch with former cast members? I think you must be approaching 200 over the years. Is there like an alumni association or anything?
Well, we do this thing called the Challenge. It was originally called the Real World Road Rules Challenge, and it basically brings back former cast members to do these challenges. They all live together. It's usually in a tropical location, and there's these very physical challenges and very mental challenges that they have to do. And you get both the excitement of having them back and finding out what's happened to them. Often there's unfinished business sometimes between cast members that we get to see that resolved. And then you get to see them put under pressure of having to do these challenges. We've done that show now for 21 seasons. We're shooting the 22nd season. So we get to, I was just off at the current challenge in the Dominican Republic and got a chance to talk to, these cast members, some of them who go back, 15 years. Occasionally I went to Judd and Pam's wedding, who met on the Real World San Francisco. We've had a number of relationships begin and marriages that have taken place because of the show. We have a Real World person who's in Congress, Sean Duffy, who is a Tea Party guy from Wisconsin, and he met his wife, Rachel Campos, she was on the Real World Boston, and they met on the very first Real World Road Rules Challenge. And while I don't necessarily agree with Sean's politics, in the Republican primary, I sent some money his way because I wanted to support him. Couldn't support him in the general election, but I supported him in the primary. And I'm very proud of some of the achievements of our former cast members. Many of them have chosen, they've done the Real World, and then they've never done a challenge, they've never done a reunion. They've gone on and, become doctors and lawyers and business people. Others of them have chosen to continue to stay in our lives, and I respect whatever decision they make.
But you have kept up, at least tracked kind of most of them?
I stay in touch with the ones who want to stay in touch. We've done, a number of reunions. We did a reunion after the 4th season. We did a reunion after the 10th season. We did a reunion after the 20th season. And so these have been opportunities to catch up with people.
What's been your biggest challenge over the course of producing this series?
I think the biggest challenge initially was finding the right people to make the show, finding the editors, finding the story people, finding the field producers. Beyond that, I think it's really the challenge is just keeping the show fresh and always finding some new way in for the viewer. It's still as exciting as ever to make. There's always a feeling that you could do a better job. Casting is not a science, and so there are seasons when, for whatever reason, we end up with a cast that's not quite as good as we hoped, and it makes the post-production of the show and the editing much more challenging. And then there are other seasons where something just the mixture of people just clicks, and you get great story, and you get people who you root for and care about. And those seasons are much easier in the editorial process. So I think it's still a challenging show and an exciting show to make. And I feel very blessed that I get to make a show where basically we get to roll cameras for 16, 17 weeks, and we don't have to manipulate it, and we bring it back, and then we get to tell the stories of what happened. Is
San Francisco your favorite season because of its breakthrough nature, or do you have a favorite season?
The first season was very powerful because I was there for virtually all of those days that we were producing the show, and I was doing the interviews, so I was so sort of emotionally involved. And when it finished at the end of the 13 weeks, I went into a major depression because I didn't quite know what to do because I had been so focused on that show. So for me, maybe the highs and lows aren't as great now that I'm not as involved on a day-to-day basis, but I still participate in the casting. We just did the casting for the 27th season, and I was there for every day of the casting for the finals. And I'm involved with a selection of the city, and I'm involved in every single episode in terms of watching the string outs and the outline and the cuts. It's still, for us, Bunim/Murray, it's really our calling card. It's the show that we're most known for, despite the fact that we've gone on to do such shows as Road Rules, Making the Band, The Simple Life, the Kardashian shows, Project Runway now, the Bad Girls Club, Love Games. Despite all these other shows we've done, really it's The Real World that is forever going to be the show that most defines this company.
Were you in production on 9/11 with The Real World?
We were in production on 9/11. In fact, I was in Chicago where we were shooting The Real World. And I was in Chicago not specifically for The Real World. We had just shot a series for Fox called Love Cruise. And it was a dating show set on a windjammer. And we shot it all through the Southern Antilles. And a lot of the cast came from Chicago. So we did a party in Chicago, a premiere party. And a lot of the cast were going to be on morning talk shows. And I woke up that morning, September 11th, to turn on the TV to see our cast members from Love Cruise appearing on the local morning talk shows because the show itself was going to premiere that night. And when I turned the TV on, I didn't see our cast members. What I saw was, the World Trade Towers and what was going on. And of course, I was in downtown Chicago, in the shadow of the Sears Tower, and everyone was like going crazy. And so once it was clear to me that there would be no interviews that morning with the Love Cruise cast, and very quickly it was clear to me that the show would not premiere that night, I zipped over to the Real World house to talk about how we were going to handle it. And normally we don't have a TV in the Real World house. In the early years we did, but we realized that watching people watch TV is not good television. And it also screws with the audio, because if you have music or television in the background when you're trying to edit down a scene, you're going to hear this behind it. So starting, I think once after the London season, we didn't allow any television in the house. But we felt for this we needed to bring a TV into the house. So we brought a small TV into the house for the cast so that they could watch what was going on, because they weren't going to be able to go home. Airlines were shut down. There was no way anyone was going to move. And we made the decision to keep shooting. And, so we were sort of trying to sort of calm our crew and sort of deal with all of the personal issues that people were facing, trying to help people make calls to their loved ones. But at the same time, we wanted to document this. And, it's a pretty powerful episode as we watch these cast members reach out to their loved ones over the phone and try and talk to them and find out if they're okay. We did have cast members who were from the New York area and were worried about their families. And so we made an episode out of it, and I think it was important.
What's the legacy of The Real World?
I think the legacy of The Real World is that real life can be as compelling as a scripted drama or comedy, and in some cases, Real World can be more dramatic or funnier than real life. I think when I watched The Simple Life that we did that first season, particularly, it was running behind some show called Method and Red, I think. And Method and Red looked so dated next to The Simple Life. It just fell flat, you know. And then suddenly you're with Paris and Nicole, and they're on this farm, and it was just, I mean, seeing those two shows back to back on Fox, it was fascinating. It really showed the strength of reality television when it's good.
How did you come up with the Road Rules?
With Road Rules? Mm-hmm. Road Rules, I have Joe Davola to thank. Joe Davola was an exec at MTV in the early years. Then he went to Fox, and then he came back to MTV. And he said to them when he came back, it was, I think, we were shooting the 3rd season in San Francisco. And he said to Doug Herzog and the other folks there, he goes, why isn't there a spin-off of The Real World? You've got this hugely successful show. You should be doing a spin-off. And, you know, the charming thing about MTV, and actually probably one of its strengths, is most of the people who worked at MTV never worked at CBS, ABC, or NBC. You know, they were making their own path, and it never occurred to them that there should be a spin-off. And so Joe said, John, you should have a spin-off. And I did this show once where there were some people in a van or something going across America, and it was sort of interesting. Maybe you could do something along those lines. And so we figured out, you know, instead of sending 7 kids to, you know, an urban center, we would take 6 kids and send them off in an RV to explore America, and that we would give them some missions. At each stop, they would have to do a mission, and if they did all their missions, they'd get a handsome reward. So it was sort of the first sort of competition reality show, but it was a very sort of soft competition because we wanted to keep it very real. And one of the funny things about that was in reality shows, often you ask, well, who's going to be the mayor? The mayor is the person who explains the rules to someone about a challenge. And one of the very first missions they had was in Nogales, New Mexico. And the mayor of the town set up the challenge. He also ended up having a little fling with one of our cast members. Anyway, and that's how we started to use that phrase, the mayor. And another thing was on Road Rules is because we were traveling, it was harder to do sit-down interviews. So we started doing something we called an OTF, on the fly, which has become another term that a lot of people have adapted, which is basically capturing the interview in the moment. So you and I are doing something, we finished it, and the cameraman says, hey, can you step out of that for a moment? Make sure he has a slightly different background, and he asks you to talk about what just happened. So that we have, you know, so that you're still panting and you're still in that same sort of feeling. It's sort of as a way to do the confessional on the road.
And they're wearing the same thing they're wearing.
And they're wearing the same thing
right?
as in the scene, so that when you cut it together, it feels much more organic than suddenly popping out into some other backdrop.
And something else that's been widely adopted in reality and you know, all kind of nonfiction storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely.
It didn't come from Warren Beatty, I guess.
That part that we came up with. Right. You know, we advanced it a little bit.
Did you set out to do Road Rules with a different sort of tone than The Real World?
Yeah, I mean, I think Road Rules was it was blue sky. It was open road. It was, you know, it was trying to capture sort of the excitement of America and parts of America that we don't normally get to see, and maybe that urban kids wouldn't normally see. So we'd go, you know, to the back roads of Louisiana, and they'd have to wrangle alligators, or, you know, they'd be in the Bahamas and have to swim with sharks, or, you know, all sorts of crazy stuff. Or they'd have to be on a hot air balloon and transfer from one balloon to another. You know, and it was very much also about the culture of the town. That first season, they had to go to a nudist colony where a bunch of old people lived, and they had to get their clue from the guy who was in the hot tub naked. And I remember Kit Hoover, I think, who is now on with Billy Bush hosting a morning talk show, was one of the cast members from that first season of Road Rules, and she had to get naked and go in the hot tub with the old guy. And I actually just had lunch with her recently, and we were laughing about that and how far her career has come.
We're going to change tape.